All right, hey ladies and gentlemen, this is Miss Hummer here, and today we're going to be talking about Unit 5, Notes 4. So we're going to go over different ways of solving quadratics, and you've learned all of the ways already. We're just going to go through what the methods are and when it's best to use each one, because that makes it easier, and I am all about taking the easy way out. So first of all, when you're solving quadratics, there are three methods that you can use to solve quadratics. The first is to graph and find the x-intercept. So all of these methods are going to give you the same result. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So you can graph and find the x-intercepts. The second method would be to factor. So when you factor, that's when we talked about setting up the x. So in your x, you have a times c. And then on the bottom you have B, and then you go through and figure out what your factors are, set it up for grouping, and then you're going to use the zero product property where you set each of those factors equal to 0. Next is the quadratic formula. So it looks like that's not showing up on here, so I'll just go ahead and handwrite it. So x is equal to opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2 times A. Okay, so each of those are viable methods. So what do we do if factoring doesn't work? Well, if factoring doesn't work, we are going to try the quadratic formula. Okay, so if factoring doesn't work, we're going to try the quadratic. If it would let me type or write, that would be greatly appreciated. Quadratic formula. My iPad is really slow today. All right, so try the quadratic formula. So that's an option. So what happens if we go through and we do the quadratic formula, but we get a negative underneath? Now, you cannot take the negative of a square root. So I don't want you to get a negative on the square root and just say, okay, well, I'm just going to make that positive because it's the same thing. Because it's not. If you get the negative underneath there, then there is no solution. So if there's a negative underneath the radical, then you have no solution. Okay, so that's your answer for that one. Now let's take a look at this in practice, okay? So what we want to do is we're going to solve the equation using the zero product property. So the equation is x squared plus 9x plus 20 is equal to 0. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's solve that using the zero product property. So to start off with, I'm going to set up the x. So I'm going to have 0 on top and 9 on the bottom. So then I'm going to be having factors of 5 and 4. So I'm going to use that 5 and 4 to split up the middle term. So then what I'm going to have is x squared plus 5x plus 4x plus 20. So now all I did was change the middle term. Everything else in there stayed the same. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. So between x squared and 5x, I can take out an x. I don't know why it keeps switching to that one. So then I get x plus 5. Now, out of the second group, between 4 and 20, I can take out a 4. And then I'm going to be left with, again, x plus 5. Okay, so now I notice that my leftovers are matching. So one of my factors is going to be x plus 5, and my other factor is going to be x plus 4. Now that's going to be equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is set each of those factors to be equal to 0. So here, subtract 5 from both sides, and I get that x is equal to a negative 5. Here, subtract 4 from both sides, and I get that x is equal to a negative 4. So both of those are my answer. So now let's go ahead and solve it using the quadratic formula. Okay, so we're going to use the quadratic formula. So what I'm going to do is x is equal to opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times A times C, which is 20. Okay, so then that's all going to be divided by 2 times our a, which is 1. Okay, so then I'm going to get negative 9 plus or minus the square root, okay? So we're going to do 9 squared minus 4 times 1, and that should be a positive 20. Well, that's going to end up just giving us 1 over 2. So really, this is just going to be negative 9 plus or minus 1 over 2. So now I need to do my two versions. So negative 9 plus 1, well, that's going to be negative 8 divided by 2, so I'm going to get a negative 4. That's one of my answers. And then I'm going to do negative 9 minus 1 divided by 2, and that's going to give me a negative 5. Okay, so again, I ended up getting the same answer. So doing this was really to prove to you that both will work. And also, when you notice this is the graph of the equation we just did, you'll notice that it's crossing the x-axis at negative 4 and negative 5. So that, again, represents how those are solutions. So let's take a look at this next one. So for this next one, we have 2x squared plus 3x minus 4, and that's going to be equal to 0. So let's go ahead and solve it using the zero product property. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. So I'm multiplying to negative 8 and adding to 3. So what multiplies to negative 8 and adds to 3? Well, nothing. So it's not factorable. That doesn't mean I just stop and say, well, it's not factorable, I'm going to give up on this answer. We then have to go through and try the quadratic formula. So then let's go ahead and do that. So we get that x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So again, I always like to multiply out what's underneath the radical first. I like to take care of that first. So negative 3, oops, I'm still in highlighter. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root. So then in my calculator, I'm going to do 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 4. Well, that's going to end up giving me 41 over 4. So I know that 41 isn't a perfect square. So in my calculator, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do negative 3 plus the square root of 41. And then I'm going to hit enter and see what that is. Once I have that answer, I'm going to divide it by 4. So negative 3 plus the square root of 41, enter, divided by 4 is going to give me 0.85. Then I'm going to do negative 3 minus the square root of 41. Again, hit enter, see what that is, and then divide it by 4. Now, when I do that, I get negative 2.35. So each of those are my answers. And since they're decimals, that's why we couldn't factor it, because we would have gotten a crazy decimal. When we factor, we can only get rational numbers. So here, if you look at the graph, we're crossing at negative or positive 0.85 and negative 12.35. So now let's go ahead and let's take a look at this last one. So we have x squared plus 3x plus 12, and we're going to set that equal to 0. So let's start out by factoring. So we're multiplying to 12 and adding to 3. Well, that's simply not possible. So this one right here is going to be not factorable. So now let's go ahead and let's solve using the quadratic formula. So I get that x is equal to opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times my a, which is 1, times b, or c, sorry, which is 12. Then we're going to take that and divide it by 2 times 1. So again, I'm going to do what's underneath the radical first. So in my calculator, I'm going to do 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times 12. Now when I do that, I end up getting a negative 39. So remember, I cannot have a negative underneath the radical, so that means that this one has no solution. And I've confirmed that by doing it to the quadratic formula as well as factoring. Since neither method worked, I can say there's no solution. Okay, and that's actually the incorrect graph for that one. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at this one. The physics department is having a pumpkin flinging contest out of the football field for Halloween. One of the team's pumpkins has a trajectory that can be traced by the function 0 is equal to negative 16 t squared plus 72t. Pick a method and find how long it takes for the team's pumpkin to hit the ground. So when something hits the ground, that means we're setting it to 0, which is what I did there. So now here we could use factoring, or we could use the quadratic formula. So I'm actually going to use factoring on this one, and I'm going to use factoring by greatest common factor. So between negative 16 and 72, I can take out an 8, and I'm actually going to take out a negative 8. So I'm dividing each of these by a negative 8 and also a t. So then here I'm going to get a positive 2t. 72 divided by negative 8, that's going to become a minus 9, is equal to 0. Now since I just have t to the first power in both of these, I can actually set each of these equations to be equal to 0. Okay, so here dividing both sides by a negative 8, I just end up with 0. Here adding 9 to both sides to start off with, I end up getting that 2t is equal to 9, and then I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I end up getting 4.5. Now that 4.5 represents our number of seconds, so since it's a word problem, I want to make sure I label it seconds. Okay, so that concludes your note video for today. Thanks for listening.